Hello and welcome everyone to today's special webinar event, Comprehensive Fraud Prevention, Managing the Entire Customer Lifecycle. It'll likely come at no surprise that account takeover fraud and new account fraud losses continue to sharply increase, and organizations are left wondering how to combat fraud in real time in an environment where criminal syndicates can easily create massive numbers of fraudulent new accounts and take over existing high-value accounts by using advanced technology. Today, we'll discuss results from Javelin Strategy and Research's 2024 Identity Fraud Survey, including impacts of fraud on consumers and changes they typically make to prevent being victimized again. You'll leave today's session armed with the elements that should be included in a fraud prevention strategy to help your organization mitigate against these types of fraud. And we have got industry experts from Javelin and TransUnion here to guide us through today's exciting learnings. Alrighty. My name is Mackenzie Puddesy from SmartBrief, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this timely discussion today. This session is produced by SmartBrief, a part of Future B2B, and sponsored by TransUnion. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll get our speakers on here with us. First thing I want to do is draw your attention to the questions section of your webinar console. This is the best place to get involved, interactive, ask questions, and comment on what you are hearing during today's session. I know a couple of you already said hello, but just to make sure you are all awake and alive out there, why don't you find that questions tab now in your console, and let's start out by saying hi, hello, bonjour, hola, aloha, or whatever greeting you'd like to send out to the community here with you today. As a quick side note, that window is also the best place to reach out and let us know if you have any technical issues during the session. Knock on wood, of course, this does not befall you. However, a quick browser refresh should get rid of any of the usual tech gremlins, but if not, just shoot a message in that questions tab and the Future B2B crew, and I will be there to help. Next, you can also check out the Handouts tab, where you can find a link to the Javelin Research Fraud Prevention Report, managing the entire customer lifecycle. Definitely worth taking on and reviewing after today's session. In addition to the incredibly valuable information, I've also got something very exciting and valuable for you today. We have got a big prize. Yes, we have a $250 Amazon gift card to give away for a lucky winner who's present and live with us today. You can find the full T's and C's linked in the Handouts tab if you have any questions about that. And with that, I believe all of our housekeeping is behind us. So we are ready to rock. With that, I'm excited to welcome to the stage three fantastic presenters here. First up, we've got Jennifer Pitt, Senior Analyst of Fraud and Security at Javelin. We have Darren Cross, who is a Fraud Industry Executive at TransUnion. And we have Richard Tsai, who is the Senior Director of Global Fraud Solutions at TransUnion. Together, they'll explore today's topics in a fireside chat style, and then I will be joining to voice all of your questions. So this is one of the best aspects of these live webinars, picking the brains of industry experts. So I encourage you all to keep those insightful and intelligent questions coming in during the presentation as your curiosity is tickled and you have questions come up. And with that, Jennifer is going to be taking the lead on this chat. So why don't you dive in, Jennifer?
So managing the entire customer lifecycle is critical for fraud prevention. And I'm hoping that with the data we present today, with the discussion that we have, that you can really all see why that's very important. So we're all really excited to be here and talk about that today with you. The agenda for today, we're going to go over Javelin Research key findings. We're going to talk about some losses associated with new account fraud as well as account takeover fraud. We'll talk about the prevalence of new account fraud victimization, specifically broken down by age group. Then we'll go into some identity verification and authentication solutions. And finally, we'll finish up with some recommendations to leave you all with. So before we jump into these key findings here, I just want to set the stage a little bit with how we collected the data at Javelin Strategy and Research and define a few terms for you. So every year at Javelin Strategy and Research, we conduct an identity fraud study. It's basically a comprehensive identity fraud report that is obtained from customer surveys. Identity fraud, just as a reminder, is when somebody uses your personally identifiable information without your authorization. So every year, in 2023, Javelin surveyed 5,000 US consumers about any fraud and cybersecurity concerns they have. And that's the data that we're going to go over today. We're taking a deeper dive into that specific data. When we talk about account takeover fraud, we're not really just talking about somebody using an existing account. What we're talking about is somebody who adds data or adds information, changes account information to gain additional access. When we talk about new account fraud, we're simply referring to somebody who fraudulently opens a new account. So now that we've kind of defined the terms, we're all on the same page, let's jump into these key findings. So first of all, account takeover fraud is huge. It dwarfs new account fraud losses. In fact, it is double new account fraud losses. And it is half of all identity fraud losses each year. Second, new account fraud is still a growing problem. And although it's not as much of a problem as account takeover fraud losses, it's going to continue to get worse as technology continues to advance. Criminal syndicates are already using bots to pass identity verification processes. They're opening large volumes of accounts currently, using synthetic identities, using stolen credentials from data breaches, right? We've all been familiar with data breaches, with web scraping, and with social engineering from scams. And next, it is very interesting. Criminals actually are selecting different account types depending on the type of fraud. And we'll talk more about that later because it's pretty interesting. And lastly, we all know that companies are facing a lot of fraud, but unfortunately, companies are still struggling to find solutions to that problem. And later, we'll go over what those solutions might be and how you can implement those solutions and why companies might be hesitant to implement some of those. So now let's look at identity fraud as a whole, and we're going to compare that to new account fraud and account takeover fraud, which are really subsets of identity fraud. So just to get on the same page, we're going to look at the legend because I know it might be hard to read for some people. The purple bars here are represent all identity fraud. The teal or green bars represent account takeover fraud. The dark blue bars represent new account fraud. And as you can see, in 2023, identity fraud losses were almost $23 billion. That's huge. And you can see there's a continuing trend from 2020 to 2023 where new account fraud is half of account takeover fraud, and account takeover fraud is about half of all identity fraud. So there's actually a reason that account takeover fraud actually accounts for such a large portion of identity fraud. And what it is existing accounts often yield higher return for criminals. There's already been KYC checks. There's already been identity verification done, so they don't have to worry about that. Additionally, they're often linked to other types of accounts, non-financial accounts like email or social media accounts, as well as other financial accounts. So it really yields a high reward for these criminals. So I'm just curious to hear from you guys. Darren, what are you hearing from customers on identity fraud? Are they seeing this picture? Or are they feeling more of an impact of new account fraud?
Now, this picture is very relevant. It's our customers are the largest financial institutions in the U.S., the largest fintechs in the U.S., as well as auto mortgage credit providers as well. And identity fraud is on the rise. And with $23 billion in 2023, it's still growing. An account takeover is nearly half of that, as you said. We spend the majority of our time working in the account takeover space. Really across digital channels, we see as one of the main fraud vectors where existing accounts are linked with previously authenticated credentials. And once those are taken over. It's easier to penetrate those accounts. There's less friction for the fraudster. The fraudsters can easily obtain this information, this, call it exploited user credentials, and their PII on the dark web because of the data breaches, as you mentioned. It's for sale relatively cheaply in those dark spaces of the internet. We see also in banking that scams in general are on the rise, especially in the phone channel. We see the fraudsters are actually leveraging the victims to be a party to the fraud too, where the fraudsters have actually convinced the victims that the fraudster's the bank, and they'll in a man in the middle attack type of scenario plays out, where the fraudster is pretending to be the bank and encourages the victim to share information such as an account ID or a one-time passcode in order to further enhance the fraudster's ability to do an account takeover, access the customer's account, and then commit the fraud. So we're seeing this on the rise across all financial sectors, retail banking. It's happening in fintech. It happens in auto as well. We see also in kind of the fintech space, we have seen fraud still on the rise, but we do see a shift, less digital channel, more so. It's going more to like the point of sale, especially in partnership card financial sectors. So the fraud's on the rise, identity fraud's on the rise. We're seeing it shift around a bit depending on which industry we're talking about.
Thank you. Yeah, very, very true. We're seeing that as well. So now let's talk about new account fraud. Consumers from Javelin were asked in this survey about if they were victims of new account fraud. So if somebody fraudulently opened a new account using their information, and then if so, what account type was actually opened. And then I took that data and further broke it down by age. And this is actually pretty interesting to me. So before we talk about that data, again, I just want to break down that legend just in case it's hard to see. So consumers ages 18 to 34 represented by the purple bars, ages 35 to 54 are those teal or green bars, and ages 55 and older are those dark blue bars. And interestingly, what we found out is that age really does affect the prevalence of new account fraud victimization. And the type of fraudulent new accounts most often opened by criminals for every age group was credit cards. That's pretty interesting. Older adults tended to have traditional accounts like credit cards and checking accounts most often fraudulently opened in their name, with their information. And younger consumers, if you look, there's a trend. Younger consumers tend to have new account fraud victimization with all other account types. This age-related trend could actually be a result of criminals learning typical account behaviors, typical behaviors of what different age group consumers might actually use, the payment methods, the accounts. For example, younger consumers, they're just starting to build their wealth. Maybe they use a lot of digital payment methods. They're typically on the internet more. They're more tech savvy. They grew up with technology. They're on social media for more than just socializing. They use it for payments. Compared with older adults who typically stick to more traditional payment methods, they're consolidating their wealth for the wealth transfer, and they don't use as many of those digital channels. So again, criminals understand those behaviors. They're learning and they're mimicking that to open these new accounts and try to hide from detection. So I'm curious, I want to hand it over to you, Richard. So this data initially was pretty eye-opening for me. Typically, we think of seniors as more often victimized by fraud of all types. Are you surprised to see that younger consumers were often most victimized by new account fraud?
Initially, it does sound a little bit surprising because we generally do focus a lot on elder fraud. We do think of them as being victimized. But when you sort of like peel it back a little bit, we do realize that it does make sense for younger segments, as we go younger on the demographics, that yes, they are the more sophisticated types. Yes, they're the ones that are more online, but that actually is the reason why they are the larger groups of the population that gets victimized for identity theft. If you think about it, the younger you go, they're growing up in this always online environment. They open up accounts all over the place. So your charts are looking at some very specific types of accounts, but younger generations will have accounts that are open online just about everywhere. I don't have a TikTok account, but I know plenty of younger folks have TikTok accounts. But the point I'm actually making is with all of those accounts, that directly translates into account information that is sitting somewhere online. And those are all opportunities for data to be breached. So there's just a larger volume of younger generation data that's actually out there. And fraudsters are going to take it all. So they're obviously going to take it all. They're going to go online. I think what we get to is that when businesses are looking to fight fraud at the point of account opening and account creation, there is that component where they can use that knowledge of the behaviors that you mentioned, Jennifer, where they need to be able to apply that scrutiny when consumers are signing up to be able to sort of separate, hey, is this really the person that I think is actually opening this account? So whenever they're signing up for new products or new services, they do have to be aware, hey, is there a criminal actually behind this? So there are definitely complementary, technologies that go beyond traditional identity verification, but that really is sort of like looking at, a whole lot of, online types of signals that can really help there. But, to go back to your question, initially, yes, a little bit surprised, but when you really think about it, no, data's out there.
Yeah, and that's where I was too. Is initially it was shocking, and I saw this downward trend, and then just like you, I got to thinking about it. It made a little more sense. So we'll talk more about some of those solutions that you were speaking about a little bit later. So let's move on. So we talked about new account fraud. We talked about account takeover fraud. Now let's actually compare those. When we compare victim account types of new account fraud and account takeover fraud, we find that they're actually different. Criminals exploit different types of accounts depending on the type of fraud. So with new account fraud, the most exploited type of account is credit card accounts. And 37% of our consumers actually reported that trend. On the other hand, with account takeover fraud, the most exploited or taken over account is a checking or savings account, and 35% of our account fraud victims mentioned that trend. So, Richard, I want to throw this to you. I found that pretty interesting, that there's actually a difference. So specifically, though, regarding account takeover fraud, when considering account takeover fraud strategies, it seems like organizations really tend to focus on identity fraud, that unauthorized payment, rather than the authorized push payment, the scam. Should the increased prevalence of scams and scammer tactics improving, should that be actually factored into account takeover fraud strategies?
Absolutely. I think so. I think when you're looking at, if you just pull back for a second at anything related to account takeover, these are existing customer accounts. You're showing an example here with checkings and savings. That's one type. But from a business who's defending against those types of attacks, whether it's an actual account takeover or if it comes in through scamming a victim of that account, I think it's all the same. It's really about protecting that consumer, it's protecting that customer. And it's also protecting your own business from the potential of liability and losses. So absolutely, when you think about impersonation scams, fraudsters and cyber criminals are going to take the easiest path to sort of get into that account. So if you don't have very strong account takeover controls that are already in place, you can expect that they'll find that weakness and just go that way. The reason they go towards scamming the victims is because account takeover controls over time have gotten a little bit better. It's a little bit harder for fraudsters to break in directly. So they are going after the actual customers to try to victimize them and scam them to allow them to lead them into basically where the gold is. But yes, I think you have to take those two things together. You can't really fight impersonation scams well if you haven't already solidified up your account takeover controls.
And that's what I'm seeing as well is, social engineering attacks are increasing, impersonation attacks are increasing, especially bank impersonation scams. They're getting very good with all the fraud as a service, the generative AI being used for scams, for fraud. It's definitely getting very prevalent. So now let's look at some of the solutions. So some of the solutions to fraud might include identity verification. So is the presented information that of a real person. It could include identity proofing, which is that verified customer who they said they were. And it could also include authentication, which is the verified customer the one actually using the account during the entire login session. So in 2023, Javelin also conducted another survey. It was a business survey of 506 businesses, where we essentially asked businesses some questions about identity and authentication solutions, fraud solutions, what they were missing, and what they wanted to see. So this particular data set, there was a question posed to businesses that was, are you planning to purchase an identity verification or authentication tool? If so, what are you planning to purchase in the next 12 months? And these are really the answers here. And so if you can see the ones most sought after by these companies, identity protection services on the top. Under identity proofing tools, you have selfie and liveness validation. That's most likely in the wake of improving deep fakes that we're seeing. Under authentication tools, you have a biometric solution and a multi-factor token solution. That's most likely in response to data breaches where passwords have been compromised. Companies are looking for solutions. And you'll also notice, I just wanted to point out, these percentages don't add up to 100, right? They're more than 100%. These companies were able to select more than one answer, and that's why you see that. So I want to I want to throw it to you guys at TransUnion. What we're seeing is, first of all, companies are not implementing some of these solutions because of cost. And that's unfortunate. There's ways to reallocate budgets. There's ways to remedy those concerns, maybe partnering with organizations that already have those in place. But I want to start with a question for you, Darren, and then for you, Richard. Darren, what are your thoughts on the identity proofing, what the highest ranking is? Are you surprised about that ranking?
No, I'm not surprised. It's based on the conversations we're having, we see a lot of energy around the selfie and liveness validation, as well as document verification solutions in the mix of the conversations. I think a lot of it's because they're some of the newer services. For some financial institutions, they don't have them in place yet. So it tends to show up in surveys where it's an area of focus because there is certainly a gap. There's a capability in the marketplace to close that gap, and it's being evaluated regularly to bring in a new solution to try to mitigate some of that fraud vector. Where we spend most of our time is tying identity to device along with behavior and linking and verifying that those identity fragments to offline data. And I think as you look at your identity proofing stack in a financial institution, the selfie liveness is being brought into that stack today. And yeah, I would say a third of our customers are actively pursuing something in that space. Where we're looking at how does this all work together, right? It tends to be the end state. And it's a combination of bringing in the identity proofing tools along with your device tools, along with the machine learning capabilities, and constantly improving these over time. And as we work with a lot of the financial institutions across different sectors, I think the introduction of AI as a fraud vector, as well as AI as a something that can help mitigate fraud, using these newer tools are going to help close some of the gaps that have seemed to have come up over the last couple of years.
Yeah, great points. I think you're right with the holistic approach. We need to incorporate these with each other, having the device identification in there as well, with the selfie liveness validation, with some of these other components, I think is really critical. Organizations, what it seems like from my end that we're hearing is they are tending to just kind of pick one, whichever one. And at this point, especially the way technology is advancing, the way fraud is just getting out of control, that's not going to work anymore. So you're absolutely right. Companies need to look at the solutions as a whole. And so I want to bring that to you, Richard. When we look at these authentication tools, you notice some of the rankings in there. Some of those shocked me as well, like the voice authentication. Are you surprised at those rankings and that voice authentication was so high, especially with some of the deep fakes that are happening with voice?
Yeah, I think mostly all of these don't surprise me. When I look down the list, starting from biometric solution and all the way down to what's listed here last, I'm not particularly surprised. The only one I'm really surprised by is the same one that you called out, which is voice authentication. I think at the point in time of right now, that's probably one that probably is falling off the list for everyone. We do know that voice as a biometric authentication is, with all the advancements with AI deepfakes, it is easily circumvented today. So it can't really be thought of as a strong authenticator into any types of high value resources. But there's probably a place for it, but in general, it probably wouldn't be thought of as a strong authenticator. So I think everything that's actually listed here, does make sense, but they're not exactly all an apples to apples comparison in some of these authenticators, like biometric solutions. I know everyone's looking at it. I think that's a direction to go. A lot of the times when we use biometric solutions today, we think about sensors that are on our phone, such as a face, voice, fingerprint. Those are common, but most of those are more convenience types of authentication controls as actually like true security controls. So, and the reason I say that, and I think we should invest in it, I'm not saying that's not what we should do, that's why it's number one on the list, is because it's necessary, because we're always trying to balance out between like a level of security and a level of convenience. But I think when you look at the total grouping of what's actually listed there, those are all different types of factors of authentication that are sort of necessary in order to create, security for the users. And I think they're all, they're sort of all necessary. We're all trying to move to a point in the near future where we're trying to get rid of passwords. We completely have stated that passwords are really not the safest type of authentication, but really it's the most ubiquitous. It's the most ubiquitous type of authentication. It's going to be around for a while. We're trying to move away from it, but it's going to be very difficult to. But the reality for us as businesses, when we think about setting up the type of authentication that's necessary for our users, it's never always going to be just one type. It's always going to be a series of various types of authentication technologies and options that you have to provide to your user base. So the reality is that you have to deal with all various types of strong authentication, multi-factor, multi-factor authentication. They all have to exist in your authentication technology stack.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I know we've all talked, offline about the need to get rid of passwords. So we'll keep that one really in the back of our mind when we look at strong multi-factor authentication, is shifting companies away from that. How can we do that quickly, succinctly, and at a cost effective for these companies? Because I know it's not cost effective for everybody. So
Yeah, I would add what I just was reminded of one more thing as you were saying that, because I had mentioned about ubiquity and passwords are ubiquitous. So as we're sort of moving away from all of this, a lot of it is based on sort of customer preference also. One of the most common types of second factor authentication today are one-time passcodes. We're constantly sending or receiving one-time passcodes and we're used to it. Consumers are used to one-time passcodes, particularly over SMS, because again, it's ubiquitous. You don't need to install anything to be able to get a one-time passcode. It's just part of the service that you're accustomed to. So for those reasons, because of preference, because of ubiquity and being able to get it, to receive that kind of passcode, it's going to take a while to get to that authentication utopia that we need. But so when we think about how do we deal with authentication, we have to invest in where we're going in the future, but we also have to invest in the authentication technologies that we're using right now. So if your most common type of authentication continues to be password and one-time passcodes, there are ways today to be able to secure that even better than it exists. So there are ways to look at one-time passcodes and to be able to secure it, even though it may be going over what would be considered a more insecure line, such as SMS. But there's certainly ways to make it more secure.
Right, and I think part of shifting to multi-factor authentication, strong multi-factor authentication, or using current authentication like you're talking about, is being upfront and transparent with consumers. What we found is consumers are more likely to give more information or more authentication methods, newer technologies, like biometrics, as long as you tell them what you're collecting and why you're collecting that information, what you're doing with it. If you just say, we want to collect your fingerprints because we want to have your video, because nobody's going to give you that. So tell them, it's for fraud prevention, it's for money laundering prevention. There's an absolute good reason why we're collecting this information. It's also required for KYC checks in the Bank Secrecy Act. So again, transparency, I think, is key. And so we talked about new account fraud. We talked about account takeover fraud. We gave you some of those technology solutions for companies. Now we want to leave you with some final recommendations. So first, to combat both new account fraud and account takeover fraud, organizations really need to look at reassessing their budgets, prioritizing tools that include things like machine learning. This will help detect fraud in real time. And the key here is real time. A lot of financial institutions, unfortunately, other organizations, are detecting fraud weeks later. At the point where fraud is right now, where it's overwhelming organizations, that can't happen anymore. We need real-time detection. If we don't implement solutions with real-time detection, we're going to have a lot of fraud, and unfortunately, financial institutions are going to start losing customers. Next, banks and other organizations must implement continuous authentication strategies. I've talked to many financial institutions who still believe that authentication stops after the customer logs in. But authentication is so much more than that. Continuous authentication actually starts from login to log out, and it assesses the customer during the entire login session. And this could include things like the actual login, changing account information, changing profile information, making transactions, making additional payments, transferring money. And next, organizations, again, we just talked about this, need to require strong multi-factor authentication. We need to start shifting away from those passwords, right? They're not secure. There's obviously ways to have them be more secure, We need to shift to a point where we're not using passwords anymore. Strong multi-factor authentication can include things like tokens, passkeys, hardware tools. And this could be, we're looking for things that are more secure and that are phishing resistant because of the amount of phishing that's actually going on right now. And lastly, organizations really need to start training their employees on how to identify fraud and scams. This is in-person, back office reviews, or over the phone. Employees, especially in financial institutions, really need to understand how to identify those behavioral red flags, the voice cues, and as well as transactional red flags that are happening. Without being able to identify that fraud and scams, we can't stop it. So I want to turn it over to you both. You see these recommendations. Do you have any other recommendations for organizations who might be looking to protect consumer accounts or even prevent identity fraud?
Sure, I can take that. One, I think everything you're recommending, I agree with all of that, and I'm not going to add anything to that list because I think it's a good list. What I will add is a little bit some color to what you've put on there. I think a lot of folks, and I'm going to assume that here in our audience, some of you are probably thinking that, hey, there is this myth. I call it a myth that fraud controls create more customer friction. And I don't actually fully agree with that. So when I look at this particular list, I look at continuous authentication. You've talked about different points in time between login and log out. There's a lot of fraud controls that are available that are quite passive. It happens in the background. End users don't see it. They don't feel it. There's a lot of signals that we look at that can allow us to be able to understand the risk of what is actually happening throughout the entire interaction of every session that is actually happening. And it's that type of data that allows you to create that continuous authentication, that risk-based authentication, to decide whether any type of step up challenges is necessary. And I bring that up because, when I think about friction, I know we think about, in financial services, multi-factor authentication is common. It's de facto, it's default. But when I think about other industries like the retail, e-commerce type of industry, we're still very hesitant to actually introduce multi-factor authentication because we do think it will stop transactions. It will stop transactional conversions. But I do think we need to sort of encourage a better way to deal with guest checkouts, to be able to make it easier for returning customers to have an account. And I think the technology is there today to be able to make that happen. And so for all the good customers, they can have a very passive, friction-free experience, but really only like the smallest minority of a population that is truly risky and bad. That's the one that you do want to treat with a little bit more suspicion. But I do think the capabilities are available now. So it's probably something we have to talk more about, but probably said more than I want
to. I'll just add on, Richard. I too wouldn't add anything else to this list, but I'll provide a little bit more color on some recent conversations with the industry. There's fraudsters, especially in the account takeover space. Fraudsters are attacking financial institutions across multiple channels to perpetuate one event. So, for example, they'll leverage the digital channel and the phone channel, both calling into the bank as well as spoofing the bank's number and calling the customer to perpetuate the fraud. So what we're beginning to see this evolution of this omni-channel fraud mitigation strategy and using signals from all the channels in concert with transaction data inside the bank to build better models to prevent account takeover. So leveraging the authentication of an inbound phone call along with the risk assessment you do on a device before you send a one-time passcode, looking at when the timestamp of those inbound calls and one-time passcode requests were made, combined with the attempt to access an account digitally with a failed password or a failed account ID in concert with those other two channels, looking at all that together to create risk signals on, do we think this is our customer or do we think this is someone impersonating our customer who's calling in? That's where the evolution's headed. And bringing that all together with machine learning and custom modeling is where the industry is starting to head.
I think that's a great point, Darren. When traditionally, at least financial institutions have looked at individual transactions. There's single risk rules. There's single monitoring rules where it's one transaction. If they make a transaction that's over this, it gets flagged or alerted. But looking at it holistically, then using that technology, I think really gives a better picture. And I think it's going to yield fewer false positives. It's going to yield less fraud that actually comes in because you're going to be able to detect fraud quicker, again, in real time. So I think looking at that omni-channel, I think that's a great idea.
Hey, great job, everyone. Thank you. I've been enjoying listening to this panel, this discussion, and we absolutely do have quite a few questions here from the audience. So I'm going to try to voice as many of those as I can as some time allows for today. And I suppose any of you can jump in on this, just as you've been discussing amongst yourselves. And if something specifically does pertain to one of you, I'll do my best to direct it. But if these are kind of more general, again, feel free to kind of jump in and claim the question and then add on, and banter is welcome. So first question I've got here is, do you believe fraudsters target subprime and near prime credit offers because these new accounts may have less risk controls?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that one. I think traditionally that was the case, but it's not always that's not the case today. Certainly subprime and near prime are target areas. We're also seeing high identity fraud risk in the prime and super prime space too, as fraudsters have moved up the risk tiers. They've been able to do so for a couple of reasons, right? The data breaches we've talked about, that there's more identity data available than ever before in the dark web and out in the spaces where the fraudsters can claim this information. I think historically, maybe some more of the prime and super prime space, that's where it was less controls were in place. But as controls have been enhanced there because of the past fraud, now you're starting to see a fraud across the entire spectrum. Secondly, there's oftentimes on especially account takeover, there's more to gain by attacking the prime and super prime space. And the fraudsters have been able to penetrate those accounts with very sophisticated designed attacks onto those accounts, and then their bounty is obviously higher. Thirdly, we're starting to see a lot of synthetic ID too that has gained tenure, if you will. So it shows up sometimes more as a prime and super prime type ID. And then we're also starting to see a lot of fraud shift into vectors like the auto space, where once the fraud's perpetuated, the collateral is very rich, right? So when you're able to disguise the identity and take possession of the automobile, and then the fraud rings tend to take that collateral and sell it into their distribution channels, and it often happens across the fraud spectrum. So we're starting to see a lot more auto lenders spend more time and resources in that prime and super prime space, especially those are the types of customers who are typically buying the more expensive cars. So we're seeing it across all the risk tiers and growing identity fraud across all of them.
I was just going to add in just a little bit of color to what you said, Darren, because you mentioned with synthetic IDs that they're getting a little bit more tenured, and I like the way you sort of said that. But this is where fraudsters have gotten a lot more sophisticated over time, where to create that tenured view. And that's that. And when you say that, if you're not following what Darren said, it's really, they know how to take an identity, like a synthetic identity that they create, and they'll mature it over time. So they generally will start off, because it's like new to credit. They'll start off in the subprime, but they will take these identities and they will build them up over time. They invest in these identities and they will build them up. And then what happens with that is, they will then get them into a prime and super prime category. And, generally this is probably where the question originates from. They will use that to be able to get access to much larger value of credit. And so when you think about this, sophisticated, criminal organizations, they put all this investment into synthetic IDs. Once they use it and once they're caught, they don't let them go sit somewhere. They also have techniques to resurrect it. So this is a problem that we have to deal with in the industry. We over here at TransUnion, we do 2 reports a year on this, actually. There's an annual report and a semi-annual report. We're constantly watching, what's going on with synthetic identities, particularly in the US. And we know the total lending exposures they apply to synthetic identities are well over $3 billion US at this moment. And that's on the lower side, because they tend to be a little bit more conservative, when you look at it. But it has been growing steadily. So that problem is continuing to rise. Just wanted to add that in.
I think that's great. Honestly, you guys myth busted that and then added so much more. So thank you for doing that and really adding some color and some context and updating that. Next question I've got. There's been a lot of talk about financial services accounts being at risk for new account fraud and account takeover fraud. What non-financial services accounts could also be targets for fraudsters?
Well, I guess I'll take that. I mean, yes, they don't all have to be financial services. Anywhere that accounts are created online can be a target, but if generally you have to think, you have to get into the mind of what a fraudster is, why criminals are doing this, and it's really to profit. They're trying to, so they're always going to where the money is, and money exists sort of everywhere. Financial institutions tend to get the bulk of the focus, because generally that's where money sits. But this is also why e-commerce vendors are targeted. This is why travel and hospitality is targeted. If you think about where anywhere there are loyalty programs, that is heavily targeted, because those programs equal to some form of currency, which equals money, which has value, which can be used elsewhere. So anywhere where there is anything that has some monetary value is a target.
Yeah, I would just add, we've kind of talked a little bit about checking and banking type of accounts. Certainly wealth accounts are big targets for account takeover risk too. But back to the question, we see the monetization of travel rewards or payment cards fall into the fraud actually perpetrating its way all the way to a retail store like an Apple store, where they cash in this monetization for a product like an iPad, for example, that they can easily then go and sell into the market and to get to currency. So you see the fraud, the account takeover happen, like Richard said, in the retail space or in payment card space or things like that. But ultimately, it perpetuates itself down to turning it into monetization in one form or a fashion.
Nice. That's and I think it is interesting, right? Like the more security we have, and the more something like an iPad, once it's set up and tracked, it's harder to sell. But still, there's avenues and there's way to kind of liquidate it, if you will, and bring it down. So crafty and terribly crafty is what I have to say about that. All right. Maybe just one more question. We'll see how we do for time. This one here is: fraudsters are using artificial intelligence to commit fraud. So how can it be used as part of the solution to prevent fraud itself? Hot topic. Any
I'm
take?
trying to, yeah, I'm trying to think about like the origination of that question. So fraudsters obviously will use anything at their disposal to commit fraud. Um, and maybe that question is intended to be a challenge to anyone that is a provider for anti-fraud tools, because if you're on this side of the fence, it's probably a little bit more difficult because we tend to have a little bit more regulatory components in place that we have to deal with, so we can't use things in the same way. But that doesn't stop us from. But that shouldn't be the barrier to actually using the latest and greatest technologies that are out there, such as AI, machine learning, anything that actually exists. We should be working together more closely with all of our other partners in the industry, to combat fraud and to combat any types of financial crimes. Um, I don't know if that actually gets at the point of the question, but certainly today, I know for where Darren, for where you and I are actually working, we certainly are using latest and greatest, like AI machine learning technologies, and I'm sure we're going to continue to use the best of technologies that are out there as they continue to come along.
Yeah, I look. We're Richard and I work for a company that has a vast array of signals to mitigate risk, and the advancement in AI, generative AI, and machine learning has enabled faster time to market to build on solutions that traditionally have taken a lot longer times to build. So now, as companies make acquisitions and bring in new signals or create strategic partnerships with new providers, you're able to ingest that information quickly. And with a platform that has AI baked into it, iteratively create best-in-class solutions and services that they can bring to market to help mitigate this rising fraud. I mean, all of us who spend time in the fraud space know that we're trying to mitigate against the current fraud vectors, and then you see a shift. You see the fraudsters actually create new vectors, and then we try to shut those down. So the faster that we can iterate, the better. And these new capabilities in the market that the fraudsters are using are also enabling us to become quicker and faster to create those mitigation strategies. Our clients too are equally leveraging them inside of their financial institutions and bringing transaction data along with the models and the signals that they acquire from third-party vendors like us to enhance that bulletproof shield that they have, all in the name of creating, becoming risk averse, but at the same time making it still pleasant to do business with, because customers are still going to demand an ease to get to their accounts and be able to transact business with their financial institutions with ease and not have a lot of friction. But at the same time, they're going to need the security standards in place to make sure that their accounts aren't being taken over or their identities not being compromised. So these new technologies are great, that they allow us to be swift and nimble, and they're being baked into our platforms as we speak.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of, it's not like, hey, I'm going to go buy some AI. It's like AI is really layered into almost everything we're doing now, and it's becoming more sophisticated, and we're able to adapt it. So it's great to hear that that's already happening in so many ways for you guys. Well, I think we're about at the hour here, so I'm gonna say, first and foremost, thank you for letting me pick your brains and voice these questions from our audience today. Also, just great overall presentation, a pleasure to listen and learn. And then, before we wrap this Q&A, are there any final calls to action? People, if they're curious, if they want to take some next steps, if they want to learn more, maybe where do they go? What should they do? Or are there any sort of just kind of golden nuggets of wisdom you might want to leave the audience with here? And I'd say all three of you should answer this one.
So I can start out. I think working together, collaborating with other companies that already have some of these solutions in place is really going to be key. We talked about generative AI. We talked about implementing some of those solutions for fraud prevention, to really get those fraudsters who are also using that technology. So again, collaborating with those partners who are already using that solution is really key.
Yeah,
I would just simply add one. Just thank you for having us, and then I think you're actually seeing it on screen. Go to those sites that are online, and certainly you can find me out on the interweb, and certainly reach out.
I echo. Thank you for having us here today. Let's have a conversation. It all starts with what you're trying to solve, and there's a lot of information to share back and forth, and it all starts with your use case and how bring a perspective to the table on what can you do, and then we discuss how we get it done. So let's have a conversation and see how we can work together in 2025 and beyond.
Awesome. Well, Jennifer, Richard, Darren, thank you so much. You've all been fantastic, and can't wait to do this again or hear more from you in the future. Take care.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. If you did ask a question and we didn't get time for answering it, don't fret. We will be passing these questions on for some follow-ups. So we'll make sure you get any information you were looking for. Speaking of follow-ups, we did have those QR codes up there, but there's also a link here for TransUnion Identity and Fraud Solutions. If you want to click into that, you've got the Javelin report in the Handouts tab. And if you want to speak directly to Javelin Strategy and Research, well, you can shoot them a message over at marketing@javelinstrategy.com. And with that, I just want to give one final thank you to our speakers. It's been great to be able to pick their brains today and learn so much. And well, we have a little bit more fun before we wrap things up here. It is prize time. We'll be drawing the $250 Amazon gift card in just a few seconds. Quick reminder that you do have to be present to win here at the webinar. And well, with that, drum roll, please. Today's lucky winner is Rebecca Longfellow from Ohio. So huge congrats to you, Rebecca. As always, we'll be reaching out after today's webinar about claiming your prize. And with that, on behalf of Future B2B and the team at SmartBrief, I just want to thank our speakers, TransUnion, Javelin, and everyone here that's attending today. This couldn't happen without an audience, and I hope you've all gotten some interesting ideas and tips for comprehensive fraud prevention and how to cover and manage the entire customer lifecycle. So I know I learned a lot today, and I enjoyed this lively conversation. I hope to see you all again soon on a webinar here. And until then, I'm wishing you all an absolutely magical rest of your days. So take care, everybody.